My name is Ian Winbrock. I'm the program lead for SCR, the Center for Science Communication Research. I'm really excited to introduce you all today to our panel that's being led by SCR Associate Director Mark Blaine. Today, there's a few ways that y'all can participate. The best way that y'all can participate is through the question and answer function at the bottom of Zoom. So if you ask a question, there'll be an open question for me. I'll triage that to Mark, and then he will pass that on to the appropriate student panelist or answer it himself. And with that, I will pass it on to our Associate Director, Mark Blaine. Mark?
Okay, thank you, Ian. And thank you to all of you who are here today for this webinar, and especially thank you to our panelists. And I'll get this kicked off. Let me share screen here and go to play. Is everyone seeing that okay? Thank you, Francis. Good for the nods. Okay, so we're calling this the Science Communication Experience, and the subhead, UO students, research, creative work, and new opportunities. New opportunities is me saying, we have a proposed minor that's being considered right now. Hopefully that is completed. I'm actually going to be talking to the council about that tomorrow. So, but as a way to kick this off, and the 3 new courses that we've had approved, we thought we'd bring in some student panelists to talk about the work that we've actually done. And I think that I want to give you a little bit of backstory on the Center for Science Communication Research, which is who I represent, and that's part of the School of Journalism and Communication. And as a way of kind of building this up and saying, this has been very student driven over the years, and wanted to kind of just get into that a little bit, and then you can see the good work that our students are doing right now, and which is super exciting. And I think there's some really interesting things that are happening. For example, Francis took a course a few terms ago and is now applying things, at the Emerald, for example, and Eden is in the thick of a course as we speak. So this is all kind of happening in real time as we go. And again, wanted to just focus on that word experience. So I think that's a big piece of what we have been doing with teaching here. So just to kick this off, I should just frame science communication, what that is, and like, let's talk about that just really quickly. And very quickly, I just put it as, the public trust science, actually startlingly, well, like that there's a high level of trust in science, but we do see quite a bit of unevenness societally, around big hot button and now unfortunately politicized issues. So there's a moment here around communication and how is science being communicated to the public, or various publics, or various audiences. So there's a lot of ways to think about this and to think about this problem, and that's a big area that we're focusing on with the research that's happening at the center, with the teaching that we're doing, with the creative work that we're doing, and that sort of thing. I did want to just give these a couple of little graphs here too about this shifting funding landscape, because how we are funding science, I think, is tied in some ways to how we're communicating science. And so the graph on the left is showing dollars for R&D research in general going way, like, it's a big steep climb. What we're seeing, though, that graph on the right, is that federal dollars proportionally are going down a little bit, whereas business spending is going up. And so there are, if you think about the messaging between those, and if I get communication geek here moment, like the sort of the mandate for the federal government communicating its science and the people who it's funding versus the mandate for business, it can be very different, and they're very different problems, but that there is a lot of growth and space here, and I would argue also probably some advocacy on our end for continued and probably even better federal funding of science. We've gotten to some amazing places with the scientific research that has been sponsored in this country and beyond for many decades, and it would be I think it's part of there's a communication role in giving the public confidence that that's actually money well spent. So just wanted to also frame this a little bit. Science communication is an area of study in a variety of places around the country. It's relatively new though. There have been various versions of it for a long time. The life sciences communication department at the University of Wisconsin, for example, came out of, I think it used to be agricultural journalism long ago. It's an old program, but they've taken a lot of this research in the science of science communication and really modernized it and made it much more current to what it is now. Cornell has launched a variety of programs. Texas at Austin has done that as well. And a few years ago, President Schill funded our center as part of this. And 2017 was a big year, actually, because this was a year that the National Academy of Sciences came out with this big report, Communicating Science Effectively, as well as the Oxford Handbook of the Science of Science Communication. So you couldn't really put a stake in it better maybe than the Oxford Handbook to just say, here we are, and here are the things that not only that we study, but here are the frontiers of where we should be going. And just as a side note, our director, Ellen Peters, contributed to both of these efforts. So just a tiny bit more backstory. This program, though, for us isn't new. 2017, yes, it was funded, but it really started way back, even actually probably before 2010. I've got a little timeline here. We started with some funding from the Forest Service that grew into a program called Science in Memory, which in 2015 won the university's Research Innovation Award. And then the SCR was founded a couple of years later. We hired Professor Holly Smith, Assistant Professor Holly Smith at that time, who unfortunately can't be here right now because she's on another panel right at this moment around the environmental initiative. So she's super active on campus. And then in 2019, Ellen Peters, as I mentioned before, joined the SOJC, and she is a world-renowned decision science researcher and has really kind of given us many new gears as far as what the SCR can go do. And then excitingly, what was it, a week and a half ago, we have IHP approval for another science communication faculty member. So we're growing. And this is in addition to a big range of affiliate faculty that we have across disciplines within the J School, but also in starting to come out in other departments. And if for those of you who are from other areas of study within the university, we welcome you to join in, because I think this effort is not, it is maybe lives in the J School right now, but it is maybe not necessarily of the J School. It probably should be an interdisciplinary endeavor. And the last thing I want to do is, what's with the glacier and the puddle splash? This is an image from Science in Memory from a few years ago. Just some very, very talented students send them out with cameras in beautiful places, and then creative ideas. And I just really like this idea, this metaphor of, this is the rock in a relatively still pond, and we're going to be rippling out for a long, long time. I'll also say that glacier has retreated quite a bit from the time that this rock has been thrown. So there is a fair amount of urgency to what we're talking about here and on a lot of different fronts. Last, before I introduce our group here, just look for, we've got 3 new core courses coming to the SOJC, launching with J377, which may be on the books right now, is J399 in the fall. If those of you students who are here and listening, sign up. I'm teaching that class. It's the Science of Science Communication introductory class, but it's introductory at the 300 level. Lots of models and big ideas around science communication, and then a couple more deep dive classes that our panelists today are essentially took those relatives of those classes. So if you hear interesting stuff that they're telling you, you can sign up for those classes in the coming year. we're going to have a very flexible structure going forward with this minor and the courses that we're offering, and we're going to continue to grow those offerings over the next few years. You know, I did want to say, for School of Journalism majors, this is a way to add some science, add some, you know, add some technical skills, some ability, some to really define yourself in an area. For science majors, this is a great opportunity to learn some communication skills, which is really valuable in a wide range of things that you're going to go do. You know, whether you say you focus on being an academic researcher, still going to have to have some of these skills, or maybe you want to work in public policy or something like that. So lots of great opportunities there. And last, but absolutely not least, let's talk about our panelists. We can't do this without them, without you all. And so we have, and we'll go in this order today, Francis O'Leary, who worked with Ellen Peters and in Ellen's honors class. And I think Francis is going to tell us about dread risk, and I hope maybe a little bit about how that's been applied to the Emerald. You know, that's a really interesting idea and super exciting. I know that when I first read some decision science stuff, I was thinking, why aren't all journalists reading this? We need to be paying attention to this stuff. Daniel Anderson, who worked closely with Holly Smith, who's the middle image down on the bottom there. Daniel also in an honors class with Holly, and has done his research is on the National Park Service and how they're messaging around climate change, which is a really fascinating idea. And thinking about the last 4 years, and how a lot of different information was presented or not. And so that's going to be an exciting thing to explore. And last here is Eden Mccall, who's in Torsten Shellstrand's class right now, the science story. They are looking at the Holiday Farm Fire, but really in a bigger context of the Willamette Valley and the Anthropocene, and how our presence here, how our presence really ripples out in this place. So I hope I've captured at least a somewhat of a bio tease here for everyone. And with that, I'm gonna jump. Francis, would you like to jump in? I will quit sharing screen here.
Okay, and I'm going to share my screen so that I can present on risk communication and persuasion. So as Mark said, I was in Professor Peters' class last term, and I work at the Daily Emerald. I'm the managing editor, but I'm also the opinion desk editor. So I work a lot in persuasion. I started out as a news reporter, but I had to sort of adapt to this new role. That was, I don't know, I ended up taking it over at the beginning of the pandemic. So, but I was able to use some of this risk communication techniques that I learned in Professor Peters' class in my role there, and now I'm going to pay those lessons forward to you all. So the central concept here is that people are bad decision makers. People systemically make bad decisions about their finances, about their health, about any number of things. But there are things that you can do to help people make better decisions. So why do people make bad decisions? Well, we use a lot of mental shortcuts called heuristics. This saves us some of the energy that it takes to make decisions, but overall, the minor changes can compound over time to mean that you're not making the optimal decision all the time. Also, people have systemic biases that can range from benign ones like, I prefer green rather than brown, or malignant biases like racism and anti-Semitism. There's also lack of statistical knowledge. We simply can't learn everything that there is to know about every topic. And then there are a lot of other things, like we overestimate small probabilities like winning the lottery, but underestimate large probabilities like getting in a car accident. And it goes on and on. But you can help people make better decisions through evidence-based communications. There are 5 steps to this that I'll go over now. The first one is to identify your communication goals. So when you start planning a message, ask yourself, who is my audience and what do I want them to do after I communicate with them? So do you want people to start wearing masks or stop going to gatherings with more than a few people? Do you want people to start saving for their retirement and so on? Think about that before you start with them crafting your message. Then provide numbers. People aren't great with numbers, but they're worse without them. If you said that something was 7,000 cubic meters, that would be not super useful to me, but it would be much better than if you just said something was big, because it could be the size of an elephant or the size of a planet then. Also, reduce cognitive effort. This one's pretty easy. Keep it simple and do the math for people. So use nice round numbers. Like if something is 200,300, you can probably round that off to 200,000. And do the math for people so that they don't have to switch back and forth between fractions and percentages and decimals and so on. Also, provide experiential cues. So give people a familiar way to interpret the data. Like I had to look this up today, but if you told me 54,000 people, it would be much easier for me to picture that if you said that it was the number of people that could fit in Austin Stadium, for example. And then finally, draw attention to the most important information first. If you're, say making a poster or something like that, you can make this a different font or a different color, bold the text that you want people to recognize, because really what you want them to walk away with is this core thought. So this prepare for the big one is an opinion piece that was written by one of the Emerald's columnists right after I finished this class. So with Professor Peters. So I took all of the lessons that I learned in that class and I applied it to editing this piece. And I think it was really good. It was a very persuasive piece. So I'm going to look through a couple pieces of it here with that in mind. So first, identify your communication goals. JL, the writer, explicitly said what her goal was after talking about what the big one was, this Cascadian subduction zone earthquake. She says, my goal isn't to scare you, it's to convince you to prepare. You don't have to put your explicit goal in the text. She did it here because she found it to be persuasive, but it at least shows that when she sat down, she had something in mind that she wanted people to walk away and do. Also, she provided numbers. She talks about how many peoples could be killed or wounded here, how much money it'll cost, how many people will be displaced. And then she also included the report where these numbers came from so that if people were curious, they could go and find more numbers for themselves. Also, when she provided these numbers, she reduced cognitive effort by using like orders of magnitude, like tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands, 250,000. These are all easy numbers to kind of take in. And she provided experiential cues. I'm from the Midwest, so I've never been through an earthquake. I don't know the difference between a 6.0 and a 9.0. So she says here that they can last 5 minutes. I know how long that is. It's about the length of this presentation. And if I'd been shaking the whole time, I would have been terrified. She also says that the entire coastline dropped 3 to 6 feet. I can imagine suddenly dropping 3 to 6 feet and how bad that would be as well. And then finally, she has draw attention to the most important information first. This is from the first paragraph of that column. She says, residents from Vancouver Island to Portland and so on need to create a plan now to prepare for this inevitable force of nature. That's it. If you walked away after reading the first paragraph, you might not know quite how to prepare, but you would have gotten the most important information from this column that she wrote. So people are bad decision makers, but you've seen here that it is possible to help people. And then I have a slide here for questions, but I imagine that the Q&A section will take care of that. Okay, excellent.
Well, thank you. Thanks so much. It's funny you brought up the earthquake thing. It's one of the interviews we did in Science and Memory up in Cordova, Alaska, was around the 65 earthquake, and there were people who said that they were motion sick because the ground was shaking for 4+ minutes. And then it was so dramatic. And it's just like, so thinking about how to merge story with data is such a fascinating thing. So thank you so much. Daniel, let's go move to your work with the National Park Service.
Yeah, I do have a slideshow from my defense I did last week. I can kind of recycle that and use that. Okay, can we see it? All right, so let me kind of pull back here. So essentially, I worked with Dr. Holly Smith. I'm in the honors program, same as Francis. So I wanted to do my project on climate change in the national parks, because that's kind of my ideal job, would be to work with the national parks and communications after I graduate. So we start with a little bit of history. So Yellowstone, first national park created in 1872. However, the national park system or service wasn't created until 1916. So today there are about 421 park sites, including 63 national parks and thousands of like national historic sites, monuments, and all that. So the problem is that temperatures have been rising twice as fast as in national parks compared to the rest of the country. This is mostly due to majority of the parks being located in the West, where the elevation is higher, so the atmosphere is a little bit thinner, so they warm faster. So I did pull this quote from the former director of the National Park Service, Jonathan Jarvis, saying that fundamentally climate change is the biggest challenge that parks have ever faced. So then, since I'm a public relation major, I figured, well, how does public relations fit into the national parks? So Dr. Smith suggested I use the situational theory of publics, which essentially would comprises of three parts: problem recognition, constraint recognition, and level of involvement. So I figured, well, how do people know what's going on in the parks? And the question is, how are they using public relations to, or not using them to communicate climate change? So what it is, I went and did 5 parks: Crater Lake, Glacier National Park, Grand Canyon in Arizona, Everglades in Florida, and Acadia National Park in Maine, just to kind of get an idea how the, if geographics play any part in this. So first we start out with Crater Lake. So there's just over the last century, the temperature has risen by a little over 1.5 degrees. And essentially what the big issue that they're facing is that the deep water mixing cycle could halt due to warming water. That is, with the colder water goes down, it's well down to the bottom of the crater, brings oxygen, which brings nutrients, which allows bacteria that eats keeps the water clean. But if that stops, you'd have a nice green algae looking lake. So what is Crater Lake doing? Essentially, they're just using kiosks that remind people to just idle when they're going around the perimeter road and recycle, and that's about it for Crater Lake. I'm just kind of going through the past so I don't take up all the time. So Grand Canyon, they've had a temperature rise of a little over 2 degrees last century. That's probably kind of to be expected, as they're in a desert. However, they've been in a drought since around 2000, and their main public relations usages is including signage in the park that reminds people to not idle, recycle, take the, they have some kind of electric buses. So Glacier National Park, this one, probably the most affected park. So it's had a temperature rise of about 2 degrees over the last 100 years. And glaciers are retreating at an expedited rate. It's possible that within 40 years, all the glaciers could be gone. So the national park partnered with the US Geological Survey. They started the Repeat Photography Project. So essentially what they did is they found old photos, like the exemplars from 1943, and then they went out and took the same picture in the same spot, so you can kind of get an idea. They're using more visual aids rather than a bunch of brochures and all that, which I think is quite effective. Then Acadia National Park, they've had a temperature rise of almost 3 degrees over the last 100 years. And what that's allowed is the Gulf of Maine, the waters have been rising, which increases the severity of the storms, which is damaging a lot of the geologic features as well as the wildlife. However, this park, they don't really do much about climate change, because they're the way it's been said is that they don't feel like they have the necessary resources to do this, so they kind of feel defeated, and they don't talk about climate change, which doesn't really help the problem. So then we get the Everglades. So they've had a temperature rise of about 1.7 degrees over the last century, and this park sits at the precipice between the freshwater inner parts of Florida and the saltwater ocean. And of course, we have rising sea levels, so the saltwater kind of inundates the freshwater, and what you have is all the saltwater coming in and then killing off all the native species of Bermuda grass, and there's something like that. So what is the park doing? Essentially, they're just giving brochures to boaters, reminding them to idle and kind of reduce their output. I just realized I never put this in slideshow mode. Let's see. There we go. That makes it a little easier to see. So what we have here is I looked at social media use, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, from January of 2020, and it's supposed to be 2021, but I entering this. So January 2021 to March 2021, just to see how the parks are using social media. And as you can see, the top portion is general posts altogether, and the bottom portion is posts mentioning climate change. And there's over 1,600 posts, and only about 9 of them talk about climate change. So that's roughly about 1/2 of 1%. And I kind of argue that the national parks are missing a big opportunity to reach a large number of people, because they could use for instance, Grand Canyon, they had a post in March about snowfall. And I thought that could be a good opportunity to mention that, this isn't, snowing in March, but doesn't mean climate change isn't happening. So essentially the national parks system they're not using social media effectively, in my opinion. So just quickly findings. So some parks are facing more climate change challenges and others, essentially like Glacier National Park compared to Grand Canyon, there's a big difference. And as I said, there's about 1,630 social media posts, and only 9 of those are about climate change. And then when going to the websites of the individual parks looking for climate change information, it's buried under many sublinks, and it's often filled with scientific jargon and language. Essentially, as I learned in the other honors classes, that you kind of want to simplify it for people, because not a lot of people there's a lot of innumeracy. So if you have complex mathematical equations, I don't even understand it. So the chances that somebody going there voluntarily looking at it's probably not going to understand it. And quickly, that's about it for right now. Sorry to kind of rush through that.
Yeah, that was awesome. Thank you. I mean, that's great. I mean, thinking about just like missed opportunities or opportunities, as the pandemic eases up and people really go out and travel. I mean, think about how many people are going to be going to those national parks, and there's an opportunity to be messaging that. So, all right, well, let's jump to our last panelist, Eden Mccall. Eden,
great.
Take it away.
Thank you, Professor Blaine. And I have a quick slideshow as well to share with everyone. All right, can you see what's on my screen? Sorry, I can't hear, but I'm gonna.
Yes.
Okay, great. All right, yeah, to get started. So this past winter and spring quarter, I signed up and took a class about science stories, which is in the journalism school, trying to understand and communicate effectively about science. And these past 2 terms, it's been specifically looking at and reflecting on the landscape fires that occurred during the 2020 fire season, and more broadly, kind of the historical, scientific and political patterns that affect landscape fires across the Pacific Northwest. And so before taking the class, there we go. I didn't really know too much about science communication in the journalism school, and I actually wasn't aware that we had a Science and Memory, a whole website dedicated to experiential learning and telling stories about these people and places. And so I was really excited to have the opportunity during this class because you produce a whole story, whether that be written, film, audio, or photo-driven, to try and tell and communicate effectively about climate change or other science topics. And so, as I said, this class kind of focused on the 2020 fire season. And before taking it, I didn't really know much of anything at all about wildfires and the complexities that are kind of inherent with them. I was affected, as probably a lot of us were, by the 2020 fire season with smoke that was all across the Pacific Northwest. And specifically in Eugene, the Holiday Farm fire, visible here, burned 433 buildings and over 170,000 acres. And across Oregon, over 1 million acres burned this year. And as I started doing research, I had some questions that kind of seemed really important to answer from a scientific basis to be able to effectively communicate about this. And first, it was, are these wildfires unprecedented? Because a lot of what we saw in the news and a lot of what I kind of inherently thought was, this fire season was something to the scale that we've never seen before. Also, the effect of the winds seemed really important because I had heard a bit about how potentially a shift in wind direction made these fires a lot more extreme, but I didn't really know why that happened or what really occurred, and whether that was an anomaly or a more frequent event. And then also the effect of increasing populations and whether increasing more people living in fire-prone areas is going to have a big impact. And then also the idea of geographical complexity, so how different biomes which I'll talk a bit more about later, affect whether fires are more or less likely and whether they burn more or less intensely. And then lastly, a big one that's been discussed a lot is how climate change is affecting fires. And that's a really important one to communicate correctly with the science. And so these were kind of the questions that when I started my research, I didn't even know that I needed to know, but kind of came to shape where I took the story. And so to kind of start diving in, I talked to some scientists, so U.S. Forest Service researchers, forest ecologists, meteorologists, that was the incident commander or incident meteorologist for the Holiday Farm fire, different watershed scientists that studied how the Holiday Farm fire affected the McKenzie River. And then I also talked to some government officials about kind of the policy and actions that went into trying to stop the fire, and then different ways of suppressing fire in general to try and reduce the risk for humans. And then different stakeholders, so people that were directly affected, lost their homes in the fire, as well as timber industry or local loggers and how they were affected by the fire, to try and gain, I guess, a holistic picture of how the science plays into policy and social actions. And then also, I'm currently in the process of trying to get more information with different mapping data and more direct observations from the U.S. Forest Service. And I just kind of became really immersed in it. So I've been reading a lot of books about the history of fire, the science of fire, and different fires across the world, and kind of how fire developed over time. And so what I came to learn is that actually wildfires aren't necessarily unprecedented in the West, especially going back a few thousand years with the last little ice age, which is before this chart. Giant wildfires were actually not an uncommon occurrence. But then even going back to the early 19th or early 20th century, wildfires like the one we saw in 2020 were more frequent. So there was a Tillamook burn, which is kind of the most well-known of these fires, that burned over 300,000 acres and reburned a few times up in the Tillamook County area. And then various fires like the 1902 Yakult burn that burned over 200,000 acres, southwest Washington. And so that was something I didn't know about before, but there is a precedence for these fires being a natural occurrence across the landscape, and they have an important ecological role for revitalizing and regenerating forests. A lot of species can't grow until a fire has come through. And then looking at the winds, I learned that easterly winds are not an uncommon occurrence in the winter. And so these are winds that come down from the north, kind of from Canada, and instead of blowing into the continent, they're blowing west towards the coast. And what that does is that when there's a fire, those winds kind of go through the valleys along the Cascades, and they push the fire very rapidly. And that's what we saw with the 2020 Labor Day fires, where overnight they grew from a couple hundred acres to thousands of acres. And that's especially what happened with the Holiday Farm fire. And then increasing populations. So this is a map of what's called the Wildland urban interface. And these are areas where people are living in surrounded by forests. And so that's been increasing. They started measuring it about the 1980s. And the more people essentially that are living in these areas, the more likely that a forest fire will affect people. And there's a lot of science that goes into how close trees are and what materials are used to build homes that affects this. But generally, the more people that are living in these areas, the more people are affected. And then geographical complexity was an interesting one, because before kind of delving into fire, I didn't necessarily understand the complexity of east side fires versus west side fires. And that's essentially west of the Cascades, wildfires occur less frequently because there's a lot more rain, a lot more snow melt. But when they do burn, they tend to burn pretty intensely because they haven't burned generally for 100 to 200 years. And what that means is that the fires that occurred this past fire season, they may not happen again for a long time, although they may reburn, especially with climate change, as I'll discuss in a second. But they're generally different than east side fires, where there's a lot of policy considerations for thinning to reduce fuel loads, because that can make these more frequent fires a lot less intense and a lot less potentially detrimental to humans living in these areas. But again, west of the Cascades, because these fires burn so infrequently, and when they do, they burn so hot, the idea of being able to kind of suppress them may not be as realistic. And that was ties into the idea of climate change as climate change increases temperatures, it changes or it decreases snow melt, and it changes when we have rainfall patterns. It may overall increase the likelihood of fires on the west side that affect the Willamette Valley like they did this past fire season. Now, to kind of communicate what I was learning, at some point, I had to kind of stop and try and figure out what I had taken away from all this science, because it's kind of the first time I did a deep dive. But it kind of came down to, as Professor Blaine was talking about, we need to kind of reframe our relationship with the landscape. So instead of necessarily thinking that we can suppress all fires, it might require a change in mindset into living with fires on the landscape. And then also the idea of trying to combat climate change for future generations to have reduced fire risk. And then that kind of came into the idea of a solutions journalism approach. So there's a lot of doom and gloom about climate change and about landscape fires and smoke that covers the valley, but trying to find a way to communicate it, potential solutions that we can take and implement was something I thought was important. And so our class, we worked with peers and mentors and Professor Shelston, as Professor Blaine was talking about, to try and produce affective and educational pieces. And so that includes photo, video, audio, and written stories. So I produced a film that's going to be playing and will be published this June. And then I've also been working on some mapping. And then this is satellite imagery from NASA that's showing the wildfire smoke. And I'm also going to be producing a couple short written pieces to try to convey the science in a way that I think will be most effective. So having an emotional draw with the film, and then trying to communicate effectively and allow an audience to look more into the data side of it with different visualizations and mapping techniques, and then written pieces that have a lot more context and different credits and ways that people can learn more to try and cover, I guess, all the bases. And then that brings me to moving forward. This class has really taught me a lot about connecting with professors, mentors, professionals, and other classmates. And I plan to continue researching wildfires after the class and potentially taking another science communication course about landscape fires next year. And I also ended up adding a spatial data science and technology major to do more research into mapping and GIS data, which I think can be a great way to tell stories about climate change, and potentially working on producing a film or some sort of research as a thesis is something I'm really interested in as well. And I have all that to thank kind of for this class, or else I never really would have known about wildfires and how interesting this science communication can be. Thanks.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Eden. And it's been wonderful to talk with you about the firework that you've been doing for the last, well, now it's getting on toward 6 months, right? And that's actually a really great lead into my first question. We're probably running a little bit lean on time, but let me ask one question, and then we've got one from the audience, and we'll start layering those in. So, and Eden, you set this up pretty nicely, but I'd love to hear from all of our panelists. You know, how is this work that you've been doing, how is it complementing other learning during your time at the U of O? You know, I feel like science communication is a field unto itself, but it is also dependent on other fields. And so, you know, is it making connections for you? Francis, do you want to start?
Sure. You know, as someone who wants to be a journalist, like everything that I do relates to communication, and any way that I can make things clearer and help people better understand is like a valuable kind of tool in the toolbox. So absolutely, I've been making connections. I try to do that with every class that I'm in. But yeah, I think that the evidence-based communication that I spoke about, it works very well for scientific communication, but also supporting any idea with that sort of like backing things up is really important. So I've found that even if I'm not communicating about something that's explicitly scientific, the same tactics are very useful, I think, to try and make any communication clear to people.
Awesome. Daniel?
Yeah, I guess over the course of the almost 9 months that I've been working on this paper, I kind of learned that tie this in, I guess, with the kind of one of my journalism classes is that with the national parks essentially not kind of using social media, they're just kind of avoiding the whole tactic. Is they're letting letting everybody else run the narrative. You had the previous administration was very anti-climate change, kind of wanted to keep things quiet there. But I think what they need to do is, as I learned, is that the national parks need to kind of speak up and use the power. Social media is a very powerful tool, as I understand it, so that they need to kind of take the narrative and say, no, this is what's happening and this is the reality of things. Yeah, that's kind of the connection I've made so far between my classes and what I've been working on.
Awesome. Well, Eden, you just sort of answered this a little bit, but did you see yourself were you doing much work in the sciences before this?
Yeah, I didn't see myself necessarily going down the science communication route. I was actually majoring in political science and was kind of thinking I would go down political reporting route. But yeah, I found that I really am fascinated by trying to understand the scientific basis that I think affects how we perceive like the societal impacts and potential policy. And that shifted my mindset towards wanting to understand better. Like as I was trying to do this wildfire research, mapping became a really important consideration for trying to show the context and scale of these fires. And that was something I didn't necessarily like learning ArcGIS in a few weeks didn't end up being feasible. And so that's something I really want to do moving forward. And that kind of led me to the U of O's geography department. And they have a kind of relatively new spatial data and science major where you get to dive deeper into GIS science, different imagery and kind of cartography. And so without taking this class, I definitely don't think I would have found that or been able to take that major or switch majors to that. And that's something I'm really grateful for and excited to use in future reporting, more sophisticated mapping and trying to convey from a geographical perspective, the science.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Well, I don't know how many of them are still there, but there is a little pod of ducks at the New York Times doing mapping that are connected back to our geography department here. So it's kind of an interesting, a lot of different angles. We've got a question from the audience from Ellen Peters, our director, and this one's for Daniel. Why do you think the National Park Service is not using social media effectively for climate change, and what do you think its barriers are?
Yeah, so I talked to Dr. Smith about this because I think she has some experience working with the parks. And originally, one of my part of my paper was to actually I sent off some interview requests to talk to the directors of the 5 parks, and Dr. Smith said, "Don't get your hopes up because each park kind of has its own philosophy, but the overhead, the National Parks Service that kind of runs the whole thing, they're very much kind of we don't talk about this thing. We especially social media. In fact, I know during my research that a former employee at the Badlands National Park in South Dakota actually hijacked their social media account and was kind of giving off facts, more or less, the truth, and then they kind of shut down the account or paused anyways, and then kind of said, no, this isn't the case. So essentially, I think that the barriers are probably more political, and that's why I chose my period from January 1st to the end of March to kind of see if there was a change between administrations. And so far, there hasn't been much of a change, although I suspect it probably would take some time to filter through and get everything there. But I think that the biggest barriers are political and just the ideology that each park, the superintendent, the administration team runs. But like for instance, Crater Lake, the last post they had was in December of 2020, so they hadn't posted for 2-3 months, and it could be budgetary too. I think I tried to find I went through the National Park Service budget. Of course, communications, all they had is telecommunications, so that doesn't help. But I know that last year that the former President Trump, he requested, I think, a 17% budget cut for the national parks. So assuming that, yeah, it's probably it's mostly political, but there's also probably some budgetary and then individual ideology at the park level. Those are, I think, are the barriers to social media use or lack of social media use.
Yeah, probably also just I've worked a lot with the Forest Service, and also just there aren't a lot of PIOs, and so it's really, how much expertise is there, even in some of those people who may have been there for a long time, and so it's like, and that gets back to resources though, like training and things like that. Maybe the Park Service should be on social media. Like what are they doing? What are they doing to kind of foster that at a kind of national coordinated way? Really awesome stuff, fascinating. So I guess we're probably going to come a little bit short of time here, but what are you all planning on doing next? And maybe I'll start with Eden, where you started. You finished the last one, so anyway.
Yeah, well, the next week or two, our class is working on finishing the publication. So the next Science and Memory website, hopefully the end of, I think, the week of June 12 will be up and running. And so that's short-term next goals, is finishing the written, visual, and potentially or film and data pieces there. And then moving forward, I'm really interested in doing more research into wildfires. And as this wildfire season occurs, kind of understanding it from the context of what I've learned so far, trying to finish some books that I still haven't gotten around to yet about wildfires. And I'm very interested in producing a longer film that kind of dives more deeply, contacting more people and trying to understand it as well from a policy and a social perspective, because I think that really affects our understanding of the science too. So there's kind of a divide, or a seemingly divide, a social divide between the timber industry and wildfires and land use. And so trying to understand that perspective better, I think is important. So yeah, I'd say just trying to learn more and see what the bigger story could be.
Daniel, what's next?
Yeah, so I am actually finishing up this summer. I have a couple classes left. And as I said before, my ideal job is to kind of work for the national parks in the PR department. So I guess it's just trying to find a communications specialist role, which I'm not sure how that's going to work out. But yeah, I think that, I know that you said that maybe there's not a lot of communication specialists in the parks, but maybe I can try to breathe some fresh air in there and kind of help them understand that they need to communicate more. Use what I learned at the U of O over the last couple of years and try to essentially what I'm kind of worried that in the next 30-40 years some of the parks may or may not be there, or they may not look exactly like they are, and essentially like Glacier National Park in 40 years, I don't know, they're going to change the name because there potentially could be no glaciers left. So using what I learned to try to communicate and get the target publics, the people that visit the parks, try to get them to understand what's going on and be an active partner and trying to slow, if not stop, climate change. That's kind of that's what's next, I guess.
Awesome. Francis?
Yeah, at the Emerald, I'm going to continue implementing the things that I learned, and like I said, I was thrust into the position as an opinion editor at the beginning of the year, but I'm going to try to really train people to be better at persuading people with evidence. And then as far as academically, I've got 1 year left to write my thesis for the honors program. And I haven't quite decided what it's going to be on, but I'd like it to be something about belief persistence or countering mis and disinformation. And yeah, try and use the powers of persuasion for good, ultimately.
Awesome. And I see Ian has his hand up.
Yeah, just really loving the conversation, and thanks so much to our panelists and Mark for facilitating such a great conversation. For our attendees who have joined before we started, I just wanted to let you know that we have about 10 minutes left for questions. You can use the raise hand function, as I've just done, or you can plunk your questions into the question and answer portion, and I'll triage those for Mark. Mark, I was wondering if you might give voice to the question from Delaney regarding classes such as J399. And I'd also like to ask our panelists kind of what advice you would have for students who might be ambivalent and wondering if science communication is for them, and kind of any advice you'd have for students who are interested in science communication classes.
Awesome. I will jump in and make a quick answer to Delaney, who I typed back to in the chat very quickly. Yes, if you don't have to be a J major. In fact, we are strongly encouraging people who are not J majors to be taking our science communication offerings. I think having people from all over the university gathered to talk about these issues is critical to making the classes as valuable as they possibly can. And so, you know, Delaney is a biology and an environmental science major. Bring it. We need it. So, so with that, does the rest of the panel want to jump in and answer Ian's question? Oops. Maybe Francis, I'll point at you.
I'd be happy to.
You're nodding.
One of the things that I've really appreciated, if someone is like on the fence about taking a class like this, one of the things that I've really appreciated is that, at least in my experience so far, is that the classes have been smaller. So there's a lot more time to like get to know your peers and learn from each other and like bounce ideas off of each other, as well as communication is important for every field that there is. So no matter what a person ultimately goes into, knowing how to communicate their ideas clearly and effectively is going to be important. And plus, I think, I mean, for me at least, these smaller, more in-depth classes are just so much more interesting than classes where you have like 200 people and they kind of have, the professors have to, you know, make sure that everyone understands, so nothing can get like too in-depth. Whereas for this, I mean, I had such a hard time reviewing my notes, going through and picking exactly what I wanted to present on today, because I was like, oh, that's so fascinating. But I was like, Francis, you only got 5 minutes, you know? So yeah, I think that really, I thought the classes were a joy, and I highly recommend them to others as well.
Yeah, I would second that. Just the smaller class sizes, a little bit more challenging, but there's also more rewarding too, just based on the amount of interaction between the students and instructor professors. Yeah, I've been in some classes where the 300, 400 students, and then the ones that are 20, 21, those are you get much more out of them, and there's, you know, the attention between you and the instructor is much more focused, so you can actually flesh out ideas more compared to hundreds of students where you just kind of got to gloss over it. So yeah, I would say it may be challenging, but it's definitely worth it in the long run.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And I also think that the courses, I didn't necessarily know anything about wildfires going into it. And when I first signed up for the class, I was a little overwhelmed. I got an email before the term started, you know, about like your past knowledge about wildfires and what you're hoping to do with the class. And I was like, I don't know if I can do this. And I'd say just stick with it. And, you know, you can kind of, like in these classes, like we're saying, you can dive into it deep. And so whichever area of the science you find really compelling or you think is really interesting to communicate is something that you can dive into and explore more. And there's a lot of different avenues within that, whether that be like mapping or trying to understand how social media affects the sciences we've been talking about. So no matter, what aspect of a specific scientific topic I think the class might be about, you can really find a way that is really compelling for you to communicate about it. So I definitely say sign up for the class and dive in.
Awesome, thank you. Well, if there aren't any more questions from the audience, I think I'll wrap it up. I'm not seeing anything in the Q&A.
Mark, there's actually one more follow-up question from Delaney regarding where to find out more information regarding the minor and the offering.
Yes, well, let's see, I'm on, my mic is on. Okay, yeah, well, first of all, the J399 is in the catalog, so you can go and check that out. I'm teaching it, I think it's Tuesdays and Thursdays. I'm so confused though, it's the end of spring term, so I'm not sure, but I think it is Tuesdays and Thursdays next fall. And we'll we will also have a section on the SCR website about the minor and our curricular offerings. We've been holding back a little bit on that just because we're still in the approval process, but now that the courses specifically have been given permanent numbers, those will be we'll have descriptions up there, and ideally examples of student work that have come from those courses, so you can get a pretty good picture of what you're getting into.
And Mark, I just wanted to let you, as well as the attendees, know that I've answered Delaney's question in the Q&A with the SCR webpage that gives information on our education and outreach opportunities for students. So
Yep.
Delaney and any others, feel free to go to that webpage, and it should be updated with the additional information that Mark talked about in the coming weeks.
Awesome. And that's actually a great question to kind of bring this around, because we're offering these 3 new classes next year, which are outgrowths of things that we've already offered, but they're now much more focused and much more programmatic. And our goal is to take U3, the people like U3, and really start building some portfolios out there, of science communication work that's being done at the SOJC, so that you can take them out to the world and change the world. Daniel, get in there and change the Park Service. That'd be awesome. Francis, do journalism even better. And Eden, I love to see where those explorations are going, like just the whole new kind of area that you're going into. So I think that's I'm hoping that you'll find that from our faculty too, that we are going to be very, very encouraging for you to explore in a lot of different areas, whether they're traditional bench sciences or health communication or the environment. There's lots and lots of ways to fit in. So look for more stuff from us. Look for more great students like Eden, Francis, and Daniel, and look for our faculty. And thank you all, and thank you so much, all you. So
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.